Hi, I'm Thomas Broadhead. I'm the editor of the Critical Performance Edition of the Ives 4 Symphony. In this video, we're going to discuss the string divisi and the fourth movement, specifically the division of the violins into two broad groups and three broad groups across the movement. In other words, Ives at times writes for violins 1 and 2, and then he writes for violins 1, 2, and 3. And he goes back and forth between these large-scale divisions of the violins throughout the movement. And this requires special accommodation in the score and the parts. But before we cover that, we should revisit how the string divisi are handled throughout the entire symphony, though. The string divisi throughout the symphony are so complex that at times players were being confronted with, 5-note chords that they had to disentangle in the old 1965 parts. And this was just a source of no end of grief for those players. And we didn't want this to be the case again. So what's been done is all of the divisi have been mechanically divided by desk, where the most that any desk will have to do is a two-way division of the material, with just 2 notes sounding at most from that desk. So violin 1, desk 1, is playing from a distinct part, then violin 1, desk 2, then violin 1, desk 3, then desk 4, then desk 5, and so on. And the same is true for the second violins. They're all playing from individual desks, and the same thing for the violas and the cellos and the basses. So for the entire string section, every desk has its own unique part, and all the complicated divisi have been mechanically distributed across those desks. So the most that any desk has to do is a two-way division of material. So that simplifies the reading of the material and the execution of it greatly. Well, the next question is, how many string players do you need to play the piece? Well, the question before that then is, well, how many string players are there in a standard symphony orchestra? Let's start with that question. Well, normally there's about 8 desks of violin 1, 7 desks of violin 2, 5 or 6 desks of violas, 5 desks of cellos, and 4 desks of basses. But this symphony has some interesting requirements in terms of the spatial location of players. Now remember that there is a distant choir of 5 violins and harp that plays in the first and the fourth movements, and it is to be spatially separated from the main orchestra. So it may be logistically impossible for the players of that group to move down from it after the first movement to play with the main orchestra during the second and third movements, and then again to move back to it between the third and the fourth movements. So you really have to assume that the players who are staffing those positions in the distant choir are going to be fixed there and are not going to be able to play on stage. That means that there won't be the standard number of about 30 violins on stage throughout the symphony. You only have about 25. So right there, you're sort of locked into a minimum number of desks for the violins. Now, you might have a very large orchestra, or you might have a budget that would allow for additional players to be brought in which case you might exceed the minimum number of desks, and in which case there should be optional desks created. And so that's how we've solved this. So the way it works is for each string section, there is a minimum number of desks that must be staffed on stage. And it's 6, 6, 6, 5, 4, meaning 6 desks of violin 1 and 2 and viola, 5 desks of cello, and 4 desks of bass. And there are optional desks, 7, 8, 9 for violin 1, 7 and 8 for violin 2, 7 for viola, 6 for cello, and 5 for bass. And the optional parts do not contain unique music. The optional desks reproduce material that's found in the higher desks. So nothing is lost by the optional desks not being executed. They're just there so that if you have additional players, they will have parts to read from. And it's important that they do because everything has been distributed so that the material they're playing results in an even balance of the material throughout that string section. Okay, so now with that established, let's move on. So here's a representative page from the fourth movement. At the beginning of the page, violins 1 and 2 are already rife with divisi, and then a violin 3 enters right here. Now, it may look like there's a violin 3 section that's distinct from violins 1 and 2, and it may appear that this violin 3 section has been waiting to play until this measure, but that's not it. Ives is taking all the violins and dividing them broadly from 2 broad sections to 3 broad sections. And he's going back and forth between these 2 kinds of divisions. The way this is handled is explained in the survival guide, which I'll show you next. Okay, in the survival guide, there is a section called Violin Distribution and Movement 4, and it explains this problem. And it provides a schematic to show what happens whenever the violin 3 section appears in the violin writing. And what takes place is this. Desks 1 through 4 of the violin 1 section become violin 1. Desks 1 through 4 of the violin 2 section become violin 2. And then desks 5 and 6 from both the violin 1 and the violin 2 sections become violin 3. So now let's go back and look at the score again, and it will all make sense. All right, back in the score, I've zoomed in on the violins, and the text indications explain the divisi that we just discussed. Violin 1 is being covered by the violin 1 section, desks 1 through 4. Violin 2 is being covered by the violin 2 section, desks 1 through 4. And the violin 3 section is going to be covered by both violin 1, desks 5 through 6, and violins 2, desks 5 and 6. So I've marked it right there in the score. And then this is happening in the middle of the page, though, right? It could be happening at the beginning of the page. Well, to show what happens in that case, here's a page that comes later. You'll see it's been put right here in the margin, exactly the same information as before, with the redistribution of the violins indicated with parenthetical text comments. So this is how the back and forth of the 2-way and 3-way broad divisi of the violins are handled in the 4th movement. But there's more. What about the parts? The parts themselves are marked specially with labeled boxes. Anytime a violin player who is sitting at, say, desk 5 or 6 of the violin 1 or the violin 2 section should begin playing what corresponds to the violin 3 music, it's been marked in the part with these boxes so that if the conductor requests that violin 3 start playing at measure 18 or whatever, a player can look and see whether or not they're playing violin 3 there, and then they can know whether or not they should be playing, right? And I've watched this happen. Conductors will say, I want to hear violins 2 and 3 here, and they'll then cite a measure number. And if it wasn't indicated clearly in the parts, the players wouldn't know whether or not they're supposed to play at that point, right? So it's accomplished with these boxes with labels. So here's violin 2, desk 5. Initially, it's just playing along with the rest of the section. But then it starts covering the violin 3 material, and it's boxed, right? And then it goes back to playing with the main section, and it's unboxed. And then it shifts back to the violin 3 part, and it's boxed. So this allows the player to know when they're playing a violin 3 part, and it will allow them to know to play if a conductor asks for the violin 3 section to play starting at a specific measure during a rehearsal. So each affected part has a note explaining this. All the player has to do is just play the music, really. It's just during the rehearsal, these boxes and labels become incredibly important so the player can know whether or not to play if the conductor requests a violin 3 part to sound. So this is how the material is clarified for the player so the conductor can reference the 2 and the 3-way broad divisions of the violins during rehearsals.